Today's book is Techniques and Principles in Language Teaching by Diane Larsen-Freeman. Obviously, this is a book I read for professional development. It's not pleasure reading per se, although it's a well-written book and it's not a bad read. I'll get to talking about its merits later. So, I first read this book 3 years ago. I was doing the Distance Delta course, and somebody told me, somebody who had done the Distance Delta Module 1 before, told me that I needed to read this book for the exam. It was actually, strangely enough, it was actually not on the Distance Delta course website. At least it wasn't one of their books that they told you needed to read before you started the course. But a friend said, no, you want to read this book for the exam. And it is if anyone's taking the Delta Module 1 exam, this book is very useful. Principally because it goes through several different methods of language teaching, and for each one, can you see this? It lists the observations of kind of what's happening in the classroom, and it lists the principles behind those observations, which very closely correlates to a Delta Module 1 exam task in which you have to kind of analyze a textbook and write about kind of what are the assumptions and principles behind those exercises in the textbook. So, you know, this is if you're doing Delta Module 1 exam, this is gold. So I read it, and I was pleasantly surprised at how readable it was, because with a name like Techniques and Principles in Language Teaching, I mean, can you get a worse name? Like, this just like sounds like it's going to be the most boring thing in the world. But it was not that bad, and I'll tell you why it was not that bad. The author, Diane Larsen-Freeman, takes kind of what might almost be described as a narrative approach to describing these different methods. So she's got about 10 different language teaching methods in this book, kind of roughly arranged in kind of what might correlate to the historical order, in so much as it's possible to kind of sort these things out. So, you know, grammar translation method is the first chapter. It says chapter 2 here, but that's because like the first chapter is just kind of like the introduction. So the first method is in chapter 2, the grammar translation method. Then the next is the direct method, is chapter 3. Then the audio-lingual method is chapter 4. Then the silent way is chapter 5. So kind of progressing through the years, roughly. And what she does for each method is she has a section called Experience, where she goes through and she describes what's happening in a classroom. This might be kind of best demonstrated by an example. So let me just read from kind of the first method she does, the grammar translation method, Experience. So she writes, as we enter the classroom, the class is in the middle of reading a passage in their textbook. The passage is an excerpt entitled The Boy's Ambition from Mark Twain's Life on the Mississippi. Each student is called on to read a few lines from the passage. After they have finished reading, they are asked to translate into Spanish the few lines they have just read. The teacher helps them with the new vocabulary items. When the students have finished reading and translating the passage, the teacher asks them in Spanish if they have any questions. One girl raises his hand and says, "What is paddle wheel?" The teacher replies, "Es una rueda de pelotas." Excuse me, I don't speak Spanish. It's a Spanish-speaking classroom. Then she continues in Spanish to explain how it looked and worked on the steamboats which moved up and down the Mississippi River during Mark Twain's childhood. Another student says, "No understand gorgeous." The teacher translates prima rosa. Now that's just one paragraph. This goes on for like 4 pages. But you get the idea. She describes the classroom like almost as if you're reading a novel. And you feel like you're in the classroom while you read that. And by the time you get to the end of it, you feel like you've just kind of experienced a language class in that method. So admittedly, this is not like John Grisham or kind of something like that. This is not a book you take to the beach with you. This is something you read for professional development. But as far as these professional development books go, this is highly readable. Diane Larsen-Freeman just writes very well. She writes very kind of easy to read, detailed descriptions of particular methods. You feel like you're in the classroom. And then after each one, she breaks it down to observations and principles, observing kind of what happened in the classroom and the principles behind it. And then reviewing the techniques, and she kind of has the same, reviewing the principles. She has the same 10 questions for each principle, so you can kind of compare them. And then reviewing the techniques. And all the techniques that are used in this classroom are kind of laid out here, which is kind of very useful. As a language teacher, you can kind of take these techniques and maybe even use them in your own classroom. And then a couple check your understanding activities, and then it's on to the next method. So it's just, don't be put off by the title. I know the title makes it sound like this is the most boring book ever, but it's actually all right. And I got through it kind of fairly easily and quite enjoyed it. That was 3 years ago. I reread it again this past month because we're doing it for book club. I've got a book club we do at work where we kind of read one book every month for professional development, and in order to kind of keep people interested in the book club, we kind of take all the books off of the Delta Module 1 reading list because, everyone's a language teacher, a lot of them are thinking of doing the Delta Module 1 in the future. So it's just a way of kind of keeping people interested. After the last meeting, I said, what do you guys want to read? And they picked out this one, and I already read it. I had already read it. But I said, yeah, I can read it again. I enjoyed this book last time. So I've read it again, and here I am with my review. Actually, I've kind of already reviewed it now, haven't I? I've given the overview. Let me go through this again and kind of go into this in a little bit more detail. Oh, by the way, this is the second edition. We're using the second edition because this is the version that we have in our school library. And again, you'll have to pardon me. You can probably already see this as a photocopied text. Sorry. We're all the way out here in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. We don't have access to kind of bookstores that kind of stock this, so we print out photocopies. Sorry. So second edition. There was a first edition before that, obviously, and there's now a third edition. I haven't read the third edition. Both times I read the second edition. The version I read 3 years ago was also the second edition. So I don't know how the third edition has been updated. She does talk about changes to the second edition, kind of in the introduction. And she also talks about kind of responding to some of the criticisms against methods, among which she responds to a guy named Jack Richards who published a book called The Language Teaching Matrix. Now, The Language Teaching Matrix was another book that somebody told me I needed to read for Delta Module 1, and I did. And I might... We're doing that for book club now, so maybe in another month I'll do a video review of that book. But I read it 3 years ago as well. And he's got a chapter in that book. Chapter 2 is called Beyond Methods, in which he kind of says the whole idea of studying methods is kind of ridiculous. He's got like this whole chapter on it. And you can find the essay online as well if you kind of Google search for Jack Richards Beyond Methods. It's interesting. One of the things he said in that essay, which really stuck with me, is he said they were doing these comparison studies. I think this was in the 1970s, where they were kind of trying to figure out, which method worked best. And he said one of the reasons these studies completely fell apart is because when they went into the classrooms to observe kind of how effective these methods were, they found out that none of the teachers were actually doing the method that they had been trained in. Or like none of the teachers were doing the method that they were supposed to be doing. And he also said in another spot, like all these kind of differences in the methods that theoreticians talk about, he said, didn't exist in actual practice. In actual practice, the teachers were kind of doing kind of very similar activities, and all these kind of distinctions didn't even exist. So that was interesting. I think if that's true, what that means essentially is that all of these methods, kind of the grammar translation method, the direct method, the audio-lingual method, the silent method, desuggestopedia, the community language learning, all of these methods never existed in real life. They only kind of existed in kind of books and in theory and in kind of, maybe teacher training workshops where teachers were trained in these methods, but the minute teachers kind of get out into the real world, they do not stick rigidly to these methods that they've been trained up in. They just kind of react to the needs of their students or to what's happening in their classrooms, kind of either consciously or unconsciously, just kind of ditch the method almost immediately. So that's useful to keep in mind because it means that all of this is arguably a fiction. It doesn't exist in real life. Now, this is the second edition of this book, and Diane Larsen-Freeman is aware of this criticism. And she says, kind of in her introduction to the second edition, and kind of to the first chapter of the book. Sorry, the first chapter is the introduction. She says, look, I'm aware that Jack Richards has pointed this out, but she says, I still think it's useful to study this. Because whether it exists in real life or whether it exists in theory, it's useful for teachers to think about the principles that underlie these methods. Because when you think about the principles that are underlying the methods, you have the opportunity to think about what principles underlie your teaching. Like, do you agree with this principle? If not, why don't you agree with it? Why do you agree with it? Or kind of what, like a lot of teachers, I guess myself included, don't really kind of think maybe on a day-to-day basis about what principles kind of underline our classroom. So she says, you have to kind of think about what theoretical positions are open to you, and then kind of you're free. She says you're free to just kind of mix and match them. Technical term for this is principled eclecticism, where you just kind of take the bits from each method that you like. She said that's perfectly fine. In fact, she says I encourage you to do that. But she says you need to think about what you're doing in your classroom and why you're doing it, and examining the different methods and looking at the principles that underline those methods will help you to do that. So it doesn't even matter if this exists in the real world or not. And I read that and I thought, yeah, fair enough. Now, having made that disclaimer, for the purposes of the rest of this review, I'm just going to talk about these methods as if they existed in real life. So because otherwise, what would you talk about, huh? So I'm just going to go through and talk about however much I have time to talk about before the 30-minute mark, because my video camera kind of times out at 30 minutes, and I generally figure, yeah, that's just as well. 30 minutes is kind of all anyone needs to listen to me rambling. So we'll see how far we get. Actually, sorry, let me back up a moment. She says in the introduction to the book that for each method you're exposed to, you're going to do kind of a doubting and believing game. I guess maybe you can think of this as like the angel and devil on your shoulder. Kind of one of them is going to be like, oh, this is ridiculous. I can't possibly do that. It's impractical. It doesn't work in my situation. It's a pain in the neck. It's too much work. And another thing, you're going to have the believing angel be like, oh, actually, that sounds pretty good. I can totally see my students kind of learning from that. And she says that in the introduction, and boy, does she know me or what. Like, she has got me nailed down, because the entire book, I was totally doing this. Every method, I was thinking on one hand, oh, this would never work in my classroom. On the other hand, I was thinking, oh, this is really good. Even methods that have fallen out of favor in kind of the language teaching community, like the audio-lingual method or the grammar translation method, which are considered kind of out of date and old-fashioned nowadays. As I read the descriptions, I thought for all of these, I thought, yeah, that's good. Yeah, I mean, they would learn a lot from that if you actually did that in the classroom. And to be fair, I think all of these methods have worked. They all kind of produced results in their own way. Even the grammar translation method, which she even says kind of right in her book, chapter 2, I think she said, it was widely acknowledged, I'm paraphrasing, but widely acknowledged that the grammar translation method did not produce learners who could communicate, so that's why all these other methods kind of came in. But like, even the grammar translation method, my own language background, I studied Latin in high school and university, which was not useful. Maybe if I could live my life over, I would have studied something different. But I'm not going to get into my life story. And then I've ever since in the languages I've studied, like I studied Japanese while I was living in Japan, struggling to study Vietnamese now while I'm living in Vietnam. So I never had kind of the grammar translation method with a living language. But I've known several people who have. A German friend, Russian friends, Swedish friends, and they've all kind of told me kind of the same thing. They said like, ultimately getting fluency in the language kind of resulted, they got the fluency because of a lot of exposure, kind of lots of watching TV, lots of reading books, lots of talking with native speakers. But they said that exposure kind of combined with the grammar rules that they learned in high school to kind of solidify their grasp on English. Now, Krashen would disagree with that, obviously. But it seems anecdotally that this is the story you hear from a lot of people, that the grammar translation method helps. I mean, it's not the only thing. You still need lots of input. But a lot of people seem to think that this input kind of combines with these grammar translation classes that they had in high school to kind of ultimately get them to a level of attainment. And, kind of reading through this description of the grammar translation method, I thought, yeah, that's good. Learning lots of grammar, learning lots of vocabulary, learning how to read in English, this is all useful. Kind of all these methods, I thought they were quite useful as I was reading it. Grammar translation, I think, is a bit of an interesting, it's a paradox maybe, called a paradox, because like on the one hand, it has been out of favor for like 100 years now. Like ever since the 1950s, people have said that the grammar translation method doesn't work. And yet, what method is being used right now in high schools all around the world? Grammar translation method. I mean, it's still being used in American high schools, but like, forget about America. Like in Asia, like, Japan or Korea or China or Vietnam or, I mean, like this method is king. Like they're not even, it's not going anywhere anytime soon. This is like firmly established here. So like on the one hand, everybody with a degree in applied linguistics hates the grammar translation method. On the other hand, in terms of like sheer usage, this has got to be the most popular method worldwide and likely will continue to be for some time. So much as we kind of snub our noses at it, this is here and it's kind of useful to read about. Anyways, moving on is the direct method. The direct method is similar, but the idea is that the teacher speaks the target language the whole time, so there's no translation. So actually it's not similar at all. I mean, it's similar in the sense that it's still kind of a very teacher-centered, teachers in control of the activities, kind of you're reading out of a textbook, but there's no translation to the mother tongue. It's just all done in the target language. The direct method is also kind of called the Berlitz method because it's kind of associated with the Berlitz schools. And the TEFLology podcast, and by the way, if you're not listening to the TEFLology podcast, I recommend it. I get lots of useful information from them. TEFLology podcast did an episode on the Berlitz method kind of way back when. I think it's episode 4. And they recount kind of the story about how the Berlitz method kind of came to be. I guess Berlitz, he was running a language school in America. He needed somebody to teach French. He was way too sick to kind of do it himself. There was a Frenchman just arrived who spoke no English. And Berlitz thought, oh, this is going to be a disaster. I can't hire him. But he was like, oh, but I'm too sick to teach the classes myself. We need somebody. So they hired the guy. And then, like, Berlitz was sick for like the next 2 weeks. But then when he got better, he kind of went back to the classroom and he was expecting it to be a disaster. And then he found that the students were all kind of speaking French and interacting in French with the teacher. Because, you know, the teacher didn't speak in English, so all the communication had to be in French. That may be an urban legend. The TEFLologists say in their podcast it may be an urban legend. But, you know, it's a nice story. It would be interesting if the direct method kind of started that way. Something, I guess, of interest, continual debate among language teachers is whether or not to use the student's native language. And I had this discussion with some coworkers while I was reading the book. At my school, we do not encourage the students to speak their native language in the classroom. It's supposed to be English only. But, you know, like I was talking to a teacher, a co-teacher, and he was saying, it's just such a useful resource, being able to kind of bring in Vietnamese and kind of teach them stuff through Vietnamese. Obviously he's not the first person to say this. Lots of people say this. Now in the direct method, you are not supposed to use the student's native language at all. In the grammar translation method, everything is going back to the student's native language. Now, I'm going to jump ahead to the end of the book here. In the conclusion, Diane Larsen-Freeman says, she says, you are free to kind of pick and choose from different methods as you like. That's principled eclecticism. But you have to be aware at the same time that some methods will supplement each other nicely, but some methods will contradict each other. So if you believe, like in the direct method, that the student's native language is only going to kind of interfere with their language learning, that everything should be directly in the target language, then you know, that's a value statement and you would not use the student's native language. On the other hand, if you believe in the grammar translation method, you believe that it's possible to translate everything back to the student's native language and that this is useful to help them learn. So this is kind of one big kind of contradiction right off the bat. That being said, though, I don't know. I don't like to take a subtractive view towards language teaching. Like, I don't like to say that method is bad, that method is bad. I like to think that they're all good in their own way, even if they kind of contradict each other. Like if I ran my own language school, when I was in Japan, I spent a few months attending a language school where I studied like all day, like, 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. So you'd have like 6 classes of Japanese a day. And if I ran my own school like that, if you could have the students for 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, I'd say, class 1 is grammar translation, class 2 is the direct method, class 3 is the audio-lingual method, because I think like they would all have their benefits. I think it's useful to spend kind of 1 hour translating things back to your native language, and then useful to spend another hour kind of doing everything directly in the target language. Now, of course, purists of each of these methods would disagree. Like somebody who's in favor of the audio-lingual method would say, no. If the student's native grammar kind of gets in the way, it's just going to screw everything up. You need to kind of break the habit of the native grammar. But I'm not a purist like that. I think each method would help. If I had 8 hours a day, if I could get my students in a language school for 8 hours a day, I'd do all the methods. Of course, you can't do all the methods. That's the rub. In my situation, I only see my students for 4 hours a week. So that's the thing where you do have to kind of make these hard choices, like what is the most beneficial thing for these 4 hours a week. Okay. Next, the audio-lingual method. Audio-lingual method was really big in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So again, TEFLology, if you listen to their podcast on, what was it, River Walters? No, what was her name? It's in here. Wilga Rivers. She's listed as one of the sources here, and the TEFLologists do a show on her. And they reference a blog post by Russ Main, kind of getting into the question of kind of where does audio-lingualism come from, because a lot of people think it just kind of comes from Skinner, but actually it's more complex than that. Now she mentions a couple different people in here. Apparently it comes from a guy called Charles Fries, who developed it at the University of Michigan, and so it was known as the Michigan method. My hometown is Grand Rapids, Michigan, so I kind of underline that in my copy. Yay, Michigan. And then she said it kind of acquired kind of more of its form after Skinner published his Verbal Behavior in 1957. So this was all about kind of doing language drills, where you would do kind of these drills kind of repeating after the teacher, and then do these grammar transformation drills where the teacher would kind of give you a subject, and you had to make the sentence using that subject, like I am going to the post office, you are going to the post office, he is going to the post office. Kind of those oral grammar drills like that. It was very big on kind of oral drilling. Now she doesn't really kind of go into the history of audiolingualism here, or kind of evaluate it, which it's not what she's doing. She says quite explicitly in her introduction, I don't want to evaluate the methods. That's up to the reader. I'm just going to kind of lay them bare, describe them, and you kind of evaluate them. But audiolingualism was kind of really big in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and the U.S. Army had really great success with this. Where it kind of fell apart was when they tried to bring it into the high schools. At least this is my understanding based on the books that I've read. I think How Languages Are Learned by Lightbound and Spotted, they kind of talk about this briefly. And in our book club discussion, somebody said, boy, reading this, it sounds like it's all really good grammar practice for the students. She said, but I could not imagine doing this with my teens. They would just be bored out of their mind, and they'd revolt against it. And I think that's what happened in the high schools. I mean, you can get away with this if you have if you're in the Army, right? That's one of the reasons why it was called the Army method. It was kind of, drills, of course, like what works better in the Army. And you have kind of highly motivated adult language learners who are there to learn, and they're there to do the drills. I'm out of time, so I'm going to have to finish it here. Thank you very much.